The shadow of the U-boat blockade already cast its chill upon us. All our plans depended upon the defeat of this menace. The Battle of France was lost. The Battle of Britain was won. The Battle of the Atlantic had now to be fought.
In the years before the Second World War, Hitler had gradually rebuilt the German Navy, as he had his other armed forces, in defiance of the existing treaties. The pocket battleships, light in weight but carrying formidable armament, allowed Germany to evade the clauses of the Treaty of Versailles, a treaty that had already been violated since 1935 by the construction of U-boats. Meanwhile, Hitler doesn't believe, contrary to his admirals, that this time the outcome of the war will be decided on the oceans. He sacrifices naval interests in favor of the Air Force. Most German admirals do not oppose Hitler's decisions and even praise him to his face, as does Grand Admiral Raeder.
My leader, you have led us, the Navy, and a whole grateful nation out of the darkness of night towards the sunrise and a bright future. May the blessing of the Almighty be with you and the German people on the steep and arduous road to triumph on which you are leading us.
They form a particular caste in the hierarchy of Germany, these professional sailors who are yet dedicated Nazis. Raeder, Grand Admiral of the fleet, and the Commander-in-Chief of the U-boats, Admiral Dönitz. Now an old man, Dönitz lives in a small villa outside Hamburg. He had been one of the U-boat aces of the First World War, and today he still maintains that if Hitler had given him in 1939 the 300 U-boats he had continually demanded, it is more than possible that Germany might have won the Battle of the Atlantic. Still in service with the West German Navy, the Hecht is the last U-boat to have been used during the Battle of the Atlantic. Returning to her after more than 20 years is Otto Kretschmer. During the Second World War, Kretschmer was one of the most successful U-boat captains, known as the Wolf of the Atlantic. He is now an admiral on the staff of NATO.
At the outbreak of war, I was 27. We had undergone 4 years of rigorous training and were very keen to serve on U-boats under the impression that we were the elite of the Navy.
When the war begins, the German Navy has only 23 ocean-going U-boats, but they are ready. And for their crews, there will be no phony war. From the first day when they leave to the sound of martial music for the open sea, the war will be savage, exciting, and full of action. The purpose of the U-boat is to hunt and to kill. The prey on the horizon is the signal of alert. Everyone knows by heart his particular action station. Everything now hangs on the word of the captain, who sees for all, thinks for all, and decides for all.
Lampensignale.
In the first month of the war, the U-boats of Admiral Dönitz sink the aircraft carrier Courageous and some 40 merchant ships, sending 150,000 tons to the bottom. On the 17th of October, 1939, Captain Gunther Prien and the crew of his U-boat are received in triumph upon their return to Germany. On the night of the 13th, Prien had slipped into the anchorage of Scapa Flow in the Orkneys. Hugging the seabed, and in spite of strong currents, his U-boat had managed to bypass the block ships sunk in one of the entrances. Once through, Prien found the home fleet at anchor in the moonlit bay. Calmly, he released 7 torpedoes at the assembled warships, sinking the 27,000-ton battleship Royal Oak. And before the surprised Royal Navy could recover from the attack, his U-boat withdrew past the block ships and regained its home base at Kiel. Prien and his crew were received by Hitler, and Dönitz was promoted admiral.
On the outbreak of war, Winston Churchill is once more appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. He knows only too well that for centuries the fate of Britain has depended on control of the seas. The fact that she is an island is as much part of her weakness as of her strength. Churchill hastens to arm British merchantmen and urgently reintroduces convoys, the age-old system of defense employed by every naval power since warfare began. The immediate responsibility for convoy organization and protection falls to Admiral Sir Percy Noble, the brilliant Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches. Every month, up to 1,000 ocean-going ships bring to Britain from all over the world the vital supplies she needs to live and to enable her to defend herself.
At the end of 1939, the Admiral Graf Spee, one of Hitler's 3 pocket battleships, commanded by Captain Langsdorff, is preying on British shipping in the South Atlantic. But the British cruisers Achilles, Ajax, and Exeter are one of the hunting groups sent to track down the pocket battleship. Cleverly judging the Graf Spee's next probable move, Commodore Harwood, who commands the squadron, takes up his station off the River Plate on the Argentine coast. At dawn on the 13th of December, Graf Spee appears on the horizon and battle begins.
The British cruisers mount a lighter armament than the pocket battleship, 8-inch and 6-inch guns against her 11-inch. But they're faster, and by attacking from different angles can force her to divide her fire. 6 minutes after opening fire, shells from Graf Spee destroy the bridge of the Exeter, killing everyone but the captain. Next, the 2 front turrets of the British cruiser are knocked out, but she doesn't break off the engagement, and with 57 sailors dead and another 23 wounded, continues firing with the remaining 2 rear turrets. But the German ship has also taken serious punishment, and now withdraws under a heavy smoke screen to take refuge in the Bay of Montevideo.
According to international convention, the Graf Spee can stay in a neutral port for 72 hours. But it would take Captain Langsdorff at least 2 weeks to repair the damage to his ship. Meanwhile, his crew begin to land the wounded and bury those killed in action. But Captain Langsdorff fails to obtain permission to remain longer in Montevideo, and Graf Spee sails on the morning of December the 17th, watched by enormous crowds. Over the horizon, the crippled British cruisers are waiting. Eight miles out from the port, Graf Spee, pride of the German Navy, scuttles herself on Hitler's orders with the ensign flying. The fate of his ship and crew have been settled. But 3 days later, in his hotel room in Montevideo, the courageous Captain Langsdorff settles his own fate with a bullet. Not for a long time will a German surface raider risk sailing the open Atlantic. Dönitz was right, and the ideal weapon for the Atlantic campaign is the U-boat. He has 30 in operation in 1940. When the German armies invade France and occupy the whole of the Atlantic coast, this now provides new bases from which the U-boats can massacre Allied ships. German submariners refer to this period as the happy time. It is the time of the great aces, Prien, Schepke, Kretschmer. Their low silhouettes almost invisible in the dark, the U-boats attack at night on the surface. The ASDIC detecting gear in the escorts is of little use against a surface U-boat. The bolder commanders, such as Kretschmer, even penetrate between the columns of the convoys to pick their victims. Between July and October 1940, the U-boats sink 217 ships, totaling some 1.5 million tons.
On occasion, the U-boats themselves give aid to the survivors. Those in convoy stand a good chance of being picked up. For others, the perils and hardships of open boats. A merchant Navy officer who sailed in 12 Atlantic convoys is John Harvey.
Well, the nights were on balance more dangerous than the day. Most of the U-boat attacks or air attacks, if you were near enough to the coast, seemed to come at night. But you had to get used to these things. You slept according to the cargo you carried. I remember particularly that if you were carrying a cargo of, say, iron ore, you knew that if the ship was torpedoed, it would go down in about 20 seconds. So you slept fully clothed, your cabin door wedged open, a life jacket alongside you, and you hoped that if there was an explosion, you'd be able to rush out on deck before the ship went under. If you were carrying high explosives, you got into your pajamas, closed your cabin door, and had a normal night's sleep. And if you were still there in the morning, you hadn't been torpedoed.
He recalls one dramatic episode.
I think in many ways, it was when I saw a little corvette, the Speedwolf, blown out of the water right in front of my own ship. And we had to sail through a handful of survivors in the water crying for help. Of course, in convoy, you couldn't do anything else. You had to go on your way. Otherwise, you would endanger ships behind you. And you merely hoped that one of the other escort vessels managed later on to save some of these men.
It was usually the task of the escort ships to pick up survivors, and often it was necessary to haul aboard those who were unable to climb the scrambling nets or struggle free from the sea itself. For the merchant seamen, it wasn't so much the fear of sudden death that haunted them, but slow death in oil-choked water, or the unknown hours of cold, exposure, hunger, and, ironically, thirst. The convoy system is the only sure defense against the U-boat wolf packs. This method calls for the highest degree of team spirit and discipline from the merchant seaman, two qualities abundant in the British character. But it also takes courage and patience to plod for day after day from one side of the ocean to the other, from the tip of Ireland to the tip of Newfoundland, at the disheartening speed of 7 knots. A convoy is an immense floating target of 10 or more columns of 4 or 5 ships, each 500 yards apart, altogether some 6 miles wide, a mile or more long. Sailors of the Royal Navy shared the dangers and fatigue of convoy duty with the merchant seamen, plus one extra bounty, the traditional rum issue. That autumn was a disastrous time for Allied merchant shipping in the Atlantic. One convoy that left Newfoundland in October 1940 with 35 ships arrived in Britain with only 14. 21 were sunk by U-boats on the crossing. Certainly a record loss, but many convoys lost 20% of their number. "28 years later, the head of Churchill's Department of Anti-Submarine Warfare, Rear Admiral Howard Johnston, has not forgotten those events.
At first, a few submarine captains were very successful in this area, while all our forces were employed on anti-invasion duties. However, early in 1941, our forces became stronger, and we were able to escort further into the Atlantic. The submarines moved further out to a gap which was beyond the 600 miles from Iceland, England, and Newfoundland, and operated in that area. At that time, in 1941, the enemy started concentrating their U-boats in packs on the surface. The first U-boat to gain contact with a convoy called up the others of his team, and they attempted to get ahead of the convoy and attack it. We had a limited number of escorts at that time, but new construction was coming along. The Royal Canadian Navy was in action from St. John's, and towards the end of 1941, in spite of very heavy losses, it seemed as though we might be able to hold our own.
Aboard the battleship Prince of Wales, Churchill and Roosevelt meet in August 1941 to agree on the objectives of the war. The United States has not yet entered the conflict, but it's not neutral. The conference is known as the Atlantic Meeting. The United States has already lent 50 old destroyers to Britain against a 99-year lease of bases in Newfoundland and the Caribbean. During 1940, escorts had averaged only 2 per convoy. By 1941, more are now available, but still far too few to beat off the wolf packs. Thanks to ASDIC, a submarine detection system invented in the 1914-18 war, the naval escorts can detect and locate a submerged U-boat within the radius of a mile. Running in towards it, the moment can be calculated when the U-boat is directly beneath. This is the moment to release depth charges set to explode at different levels. Shaken by these salvos of depth charges, the U-boat has only one method of escaping: diving. Diving always deeper, beneath the explosions, until the crew hears the cracking of the ship's plates.
In the spring of 1941, the escorts strike back against the U-boats. Between March and October, they sink 17. It is the end of the happy time, the end of the aces. In March, 2 of Admiral Dönitz's young wolves, Preen and Schepke, are sent to the bottom in full view of their comrade Kretschmer.
Half an hour later, my U-boat followed that of Schepke's to the bottom of the Atlantic. Altogether, the 2 of us had managed to sink 1,300,000 tons of shipping. I was sunk south of Iceland by the destroyer Walker, part of the escort group of the famous commander Donald McIntyre. Today, he is a friend of mine, and some years ago returned to me my binoculars taken from me that day in 1941.
The German admirals then planned to bring out their surface ships. The Bismarck, a monster of 40,000 tons, mounting 8 15-inch guns, believed to be unsinkable, received sailing orders in May 1941 to make for the open Atlantic. In company with the cruiser Prince Eugen, it leaves its Norwegian port and makes a great detour by the north of Iceland and near to polar waters. It emerges in the North Atlantic, but the Royal Navy is waiting. The heavy guns of the Bismarck prove devastating. After only a few minutes, the battlecruiser Hood blows up from a direct hit and sinks almost instantly.
That night, the carrier Victorious flies off her old Swordfish aircraft into the stormy darkness. A torpedo hits the Bismarck's armored hull. Trailing oil, she is forced to make for the port of Brest. The British fleet loses touch with her, and she nearly escapes. In the nick of time, Swordfish from the Ark Royal cripple her with a torpedo hit which jams the battleship's rudder. The following day sees the Hood avenged, as the home fleet's battleships and cruisers arrive under the command of Admiral Tubby. Despite the 14 and 15-inch guns of the King George V and Rodney, 3 more torpedoes from the cruiser Dorsetshire were finally required to finish off the German battleship.
The Germans now use another weapon against convoys, the aeroplane. They have modified for the purpose a 4-engined commercial airliner into a bomber with very long range, called the Condor. At first, these bombers, based at Bordeaux-Mérignac, scored many successes over the Atlantic.
However, in 1941, the Allies took countermeasures with increased supplies of efficient anti-aircraft guns. And the first escort carrier made its appearance, with fighters which could patrol and protect the convoys.
In early 1942, Dönitz ordered the construction of massive U-boat pens in reinforced concrete at Lorient, their principal base. And the Admiral now gave his commanders a new objective, shipping off the American coast. Today, the naval base of Lorient still harbors submarines, those of the French Navy. One of the few survivors of the wolf packs of Admiral Dönitz is Captain Peter Cramer, who has returned to the concrete lair from where he set out 26 years ago to hunt in the waters off the American coast.
I sank about 100,000 tons, including 2 destroyers, and I also shot down 2 aircraft. I went to the Florida Cape, Miami Beach, and on occasions so close to the coast that I could see car headlights. One night, I picked up a convoy. I sank 3 ships, and a few hours later, 1 more. I was in so close that a tanker actually touched me as it went down.
1942 is another year of triumph for the German U-boats. A second happy time. It is the year of long trips across the Atlantic. The U-boats have no opportunity to return to port and have to carry out all repairs at sea as best they can. In mid-1942, Dönitz brings into service supply U-boats, which are nicknamed by the crews milch cows. They are always punctual at their rendezvous, and they bring the U-boats all they need for living and fighting. So the sea wolves can continue to prey on unescorted ships along the American coastline. It's an exciting hunt that stimulates the entire crew, in spite of the fact that life aboard a U-boat is hardly pleasant. And there are always the long watches on deck, swept by wind and spray. Securing themselves to the conning tower is vital. It has often happened that an unexpected wave has swept away the man on watch without anyone below aware of it. Down there, the air is almost unbreathable, reeks of oil. There is little water and hardly any space. Men have to eat in shifts and even sleep in shifts. There are only 2 berths for every 3 sailors. However, the reward is at the end of the trip. It is the moment to change to American time. And there it is, within sight of the glasses. The promised land, as they like to call it. There are even the headlights of cars on the coast. And, with a bit of luck, the skyscrapers of New York. This is the newfound paradise of the U-boats, which begin to ravage the tankers from the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. The sea wolves break all existing records within sight of the American coast itself. In June alone, 121 ships are sunk. Then the American convoys are organized. Sinkings drop dramatically. U-boat losses rise steeply. During 1942, 85 U-boats are destroyed. But those which did return to Lorient flew many victory pennants proclaiming their successes. White for merchantmen, red for naval vessels. Dönitz now believes he has reached his objective. He has at last some 100 U-boats in operation and is producing another 20 each month. Of all those smiling and triumphant U-boat commanders that Dönitz greets in Lorient at this period, only 2 will remain alive at the end of the war. Out of the entire force of 39,000 German submariners, 32,000 were to die.
The French Navy, too, had fought in the ocean battle. Flower-class corvettes, manned by Free French crews, escorted convoys across the Atlantic into North Russia. One French corvette had even destroyed 2 U-boats in a single action. At the end of 1942, the wolf packs of Admiral Dönitz still believe that victory is not far off. For all that, it is the moment when, in spite of enormous Allied losses, the balance is beginning to tilt in favor of the defense. Dönitz knows this. He knows that the entire problem of the German effort depends on sinking more ships than the Allies can build. But this race for time has been lost by the Germans. Lost since the day that the formidable American potential of merchant shipbuilding has been thrown into the balance. American industrialist introduces prefabrication into shipbuilding on a gigantic scale. From his yards, the famous Liberty ships issue forth at the rate of 1 a day. Before the end of the war, Kaiser alone builds 1,500 freighters and 50 escort carriers.
In January 1942, Hitler replaces Raeder by Dönitz, who, as Grand Admiral of the fleet, is in overall command of the German Navy. Hitler is now obsessively concerned with the Russian campaign and directs the attention of Dönitz towards the destruction of the Arctic convoys from Britain to Murmansk. Since the U-boats have failed to stop them getting through, the German admiral now considers once more bringing out his battleships, the 28,000-ton Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. They had previously made only one sortie into the Atlantic when they sank some 20 Allied ships. The 2 battleships took refuge in Brest on their return, remaining there throughout 1941. In February 1942, however, they accomplished a spectacular exploit. Under the command of Admiral Ciliax and attended by the cruiser Prince Eugen, 8 destroyers and 16 motor torpedo boats, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau sailed up the English Channel and through the Straits of Dover, defying the RAF, whose task it was to stop them. German fighter aircraft based in the Calais area provided the ships with vital air cover. .250 bombers of the RAF failed to damage them. 6 swordfish of the Royal Navy, led by Lieutenant Commander Esmond, whose squadron crippled the Bismarck, are shot down as they vainly launch their torpedoes. And the battleships manage to avoid further attacks from both destroyers and motor torpedo boats. Although damaged by mines laid in their path by the RAF, the battleships Gneisenau and Scharnhorst finally reached Germany.
10 months later, on Boxing Day 1943, Admiral Fraser's flagship, the battleship Duke of York, at last encounters the Scharnhorst in the grim polar night. Radar-directed gunfire scores a damaging hit on the German with the first salvo. The Scharnhorst turns to flee. Further hits slow her down for Fraser's destroyers to sink her with torpedoes. When the Duke of York arrives on the spot where the German battleship went down, only a handful of survivors out of a crew of 2,000 men are rescued and taken prisoner. "25 years later, the end of the Scharnhorst remains for Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Fraser, a memory not only of a victory, but also of a tragedy.
And then my destroyers attacked, and we felt the explosion of the torpedoes, and we knew she was finished. And then I closed her, and we opened fire again, so we weren't quite certain what happened. And then she turned over. Well, I never saw her go down, actually, but it was a terrible sight in a way to see a ship of that size going down that way with 2,000 people on board, including, I think, there were about quite a lot of young midshipmen, and we only picked up 30 because in those icy waters, of course, you don't last more than a couple of minutes. And that was the end of that battle.
Dönitz now uses every means at his disposal to sink more and more ships. His motor torpedo boats attack like wasps as convoys skirt the British coast. With a crew of 3 or 4 men, a motor of 2,000 horsepower, and only their torpedoes as a load, they skim the waves at 65 miles an hour. They come in and take up positions off the Thames estuary, waiting for passing shipping. And after launching their torpedoes, they return at full speed towards the French coast.
In 1943 marked the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. In the spring of that year, for the first time, convoys enjoyed air as well as surface escort throughout their voyages. In addition to Sunderland flying boats, Coastal Command of the RAF at last received sufficient of the long-range aircraft which had up to now been reserved for the bomber offensive over Germany. The combination of air and surface escort sent the U-boat loss rate rocketing. By April, 1 U-boat was being lost for every 3 escorted ships sunk. In May alone, surface and air escorts destroyed 25 U-boats, Dönitz confessed that losses had reached unbearable heights. On the 24th of May, defeated, he recalled all U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The triumph of 1943 was due to men like Captain Johnny Walker, Admiral Sir Max Horton, and their crews. One escort commander, Peter Gretton, now a vice admiral, recalls,
"It was a very exciting time. My group were working in March 1943 when there were many losses, when the situation was very serious, and we were not depressed, but we were worried. Then suddenly, by a combination of circumstances, the situation seemed to change very quickly. I had the fortune to take part in 3 different convoys between the end of March 1943 and May 1943. First of all, my group took a convoy eastbound from Canada to England, and we were attacked by many submarines, by a pack of about 20. And although we lost some ships, we sank 3 submarines, and we had a very tense battle. Immediately afterwards, after only about a week in harbour, we brought a convoy in ballast, empty, from England west of about, across the Atlantic, a convoy of about 40 ships. And during the 14 days of this passage of this convoy, over 60 German U-boats tried to attack. This was far and away the biggest convoy battle of the war, and in the end, although we lost 12 ships, 7 German submarines were sunk by various causes, by surface ships, by aircraft, and in one case by a collision between 2 submarines. They came in together so close that they collided and sank each other. And then, only a week later, my group also escorted a 3rd convoy from Canada to England. And in this case, we were attacked by one pack of 20 U-boats, and we had a most satisfactory finish. We did not lose 1 ship. We sank 5 submarines, 3 by the escorts and 2 by aircraft, and we reckoned that we'd won a good victory.
Meanwhile, in the Arctic, despite air and surface escort, some U-boats continued to harass the convoys to Russia. But neither they nor the appalling weather failed to prevent 250 ships getting through in the last year of the war, carrying enough war material to equip some 60 motorized Russian divisions.
Dönitz refuses to give up and secretly builds underground factories safe from bombing. And now the Germans introduce an acoustic torpedo, which homes automatically onto the noise of propellers. At the same time, they are constructing revolutionary new types of U-boat, which travel faster submerged than on the surface. Already he has 1 in service, 7 in training, and 90 under construction. The Germans also developed the Schnorkel, which allows the U-boats to run submerged on diesel power in place of the old electric motors, and to run faster.
But by now, under the supreme direction of Winston Churchill, the U-boat menace is almost at an end. With surface and aerial protection, convoys carry into Britain the tanks, guns, and the men who will soon liberate Europe. U-boats try a final assault, but they are massacred by attacks from patrolling aircraft and ships.
Right to the very end, Dönitz is able to find volunteers, but they know they go to almost certain death. Few survive more than one patrol. The end came suddenly. On the 4th of May, Admiral Dönitz gave the order to the U-boats to return to Germany. And then on the 8th of May, he ordered them to come to the surface and surrender to the British. His last signal read,
"You have fought like lions. Now I must give you the hardest order of your career. To rise to the surface, hoist a large black flag, and surrender to the enemy."
The majority of U-boat commanders couldn't believe the order. 221 of them scuttled their vessels. And when the final count was taken, only 156 out of the original 700 U-boats were ever found.
Surrendered U-boats are escorted into Allied ports, and the British can at last study these wolves who for so long have terrorized the Atlantic. During the course of 6 years of war, they had sunk, by gunfire and torpedo, 2,771 Allied ships, 14.5 million tons. It was Churchill himself who one day would write, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril."
The battle you have just seen was one of the battles of the Second World War, a war that affected the destinies of men and nations the world over. The film was discovered in film libraries all over the world and painstakingly edited to show you the incredible impact these individual battles had on the outcome of this most devastating of wars. The world, thanks to these films, will never forget the tremendous effort put forth by all people included in the big battles.